Thank you, Professor Mehta, for giving this conference such a strong start. I would like to invite Professor Tan on stage again for the Q&A session. This session will be moderated by Prof. Tan, and I'm going to now hand it over to him.
So I will now invite questions and comments from the floor. Please identify yourself so that I can see you, and I'll invite you to the mic. Please introduce yourself and keep your question as concise as possible so that we can take as many as we can.
Thank you. My name is Ravi Mantha. I'm currently based in Hyderabad. Pratapji, nice to see you again. Would you comment a little bit more on the Aadhaar card and how you think it's actually going to change real estate transactions? I wasn't very clear on what you meant.
As usual, a fascinating treat. My question, Pratap, is that considering the wave that you described, which is there, and the need for regulatory maturity that is an imperative, why do you think is the Prime Minister not taking advantage of such an obedient cabinet and moving ahead with a regulatory structure that reduces the discretionary powers of the ministers to the betterment of regulators, while at the same time keeping them accountable? Because this, I think, is the golden moment, and it doesn't have to speak to any particular company.
You were mentioning the incidents of small riots. There was communal mobilization in UP, and some say the same thing is happening in Bihar. Do you find that the Prime Minister has been sort of silent on these issues? So is that a source of worry that these things might be allowed to happen? You were talking about some nasty elements getting empowered, but the Prime Minister sort of not really saying anything on that. And the other quick question is, there is always a worry when the BJP is in power about the influence of the RSS. And of course, we are seeing a lot of appointments where RSS men are being put in positions of both in terms of institutions as well as other areas. Do you see that as a worry?
Thanks for this question. So the Aadhaar one, and I mean, of course, Aadhaar is a complicated subject, and I should register that I think my big worry about Aadhaar is that India doesn't have a adequate privacy legislation that it's commensurate with the scale of this project. I mean, it really needs to put one in place, or actually the scheme will be vulnerable down the line, right? But the point about making Aadhaar mandatory for real estate transactions and tax purposes is two very big problems in the tax system. One is duplication of PAN cards, right? So I can get a PAN card as Pratap Mehta, I can get a PAN card as Pratap B. Mehta, I can get, I can have about 6 PAN cards, right? And the second, in a sense, is actually tracking real estate transactions by individuals in one consolidated database, right? So if you basically make an Aadhaar number mandatory for every transaction, every real estate transaction, right? Essentially what you're doing, right, is basically it allows you to track in a very straightforward, simple way, right, your multiple transactions that right now you can keep disguised from the tax authorities, right? So, if you actually have 6 houses by proxy, we now know you have 6 houses by proxy, right? Right? And one of the undiscussed aspects of the opposition to Aadhaar, I mean, the privacy concern is entirely legitimate. I mean, I think they need to enact privacy legislation. But one of the undiscussed concerns about Aadhaar is that if indeed these things come to pass, and remember Mr. Khemka in Haryana proposed just that in all Haryana land and real estate transactions making an Aadhaar number, which is biometrically linked, mandatory, right, and was shunted out for that, is actually that it suddenly will make it harder. I mean, look, the problem with anti-corruption measures is that, the corrupt are usually smarter than we think they are. So it's always a constant battle. There's never a stopping point. But it'll certainly make life much more difficult, right? Rahul, your question about regulatory this thing, no, I think you're exactly right. Look, the thing I think we are all underestimating, and as somebody who's just spent a lot of time reading court judgments, is the regulatory lines right now are so tangled and crisscrossed in every sector, right? So think of the recent Cole judgment, right? So we think of the Cole judgment as an anti-corruption judgment, right? Supreme Court saying coal blocks were allocated arbitrarily, cancels coal blocks going back to 1993, slightly controversially. If you simply auction them right, you'd be fine. Read the judgment carefully. The judgment has profound implications for federalism. Actually, the Supreme Court is saying something stronger. It's actually saying the center should not have as much of a role in allocating coal blocks as it has claimed for almost 40 years to have had, right? Okay. Telecom, right? Now, sure, you can auction, right? But as you know, if you have a court which says, by the way, we will consider an auction legitimate only if an auction fetches a certain base price, whether or not that's market compatible or not, right? An open question. Medical Council of India reform, right, which the UPA government tried to bring in. Not a bad idea, but that legislation turns out to be incompatible with 6 other statutes in the book. Higher education. 10 years ago, we used to say we had a bad regulatory system, but we knew what it was. Right now, we don't know what our regulatory system is. What is the relative allocation of powers between AICT and UGC, right? This is going to take the slow boarding of hard work. Of hard boards. And you know better in the power sector, particularly in coal. This is what the government is really, really struggling with 24/7. I would rather that they take some more time and do it well. Because this is your one shot at doing it right, right? The long run is caught up with you. The last thing you want is a repeal of the Coal Nationalization Act, which gets struck down by the Supreme Court again, right? The last thing you want is Mr. Gadkari is actually very candid. He says, look, we are not going to do PPPs, public-private projects, for 2 years. That entire contracting system is broken and not very credible. Right? So my own sense is it's going to take at least 8 months to a year on the best case scenario to do it. This idea that Prime Minister orders ministers and you can craft legislation precisely because of all of these actors. I think it's moving faster in some ministries than others, ministries where there is more competence. Frankly, I think one way, let me put it this way, I think this government is much more instinctively at home in the hardware issues of governance. I think power and infrastructure, they understand. The kinds of ministers they have, they understand it. They've been corporators. I think environment, education, health, they're going to have a much harder time understanding the nuances of these issues. Rananjay, your question about both the RSS and, in a sense, this kind of communal mobilization. So, the honest answer is I don't know the answer to your question, which is to say, again, you can spin it 2 ways. And this is not a spin that coming from government, but you could run 2 different hypotheses, right? So one hypothesis is, look, which is the diabolical one, that this is a long-term plan for the saffronization of the country in any case. And, what you do is you use this governance legitimacy to let it bubble up from below till it reaches a kind of critical mass where you actually can't overturn it, right? I'm a little skeptical of that for one simple reason, which is, take the BJP's transition from, let's say, about 18% of the vote to about 30% of the vote. I think as politicians, they more than us recognize that, there'll be a 15% hardcore. How many of them are crazy, prejudiced? We don't know, but there is going to be an element of that. But a large part of what propelled them to power is actually a vote that can as easily desert them, right? 2004, they made the same mistake, right? They thought urban India was going to vote BJP. Urban India actually voted Congress, right? So I think there is a little bit of a sense of that. And by the way, the social composition of the RSS is also changing interesting, right? And I think to me, the most interesting example is the debate over 377 within the RSS, which is the criminalization of homosexuality, where the idea that RSS could change its position on this because it has a very different social constituency now, right? So I think we are at this moment of incredible ideological contention, right? Both within the RSS, I mean, and don't discount the fact that there is actually going to be a lot of internal conflict in the RSS as well, and outside the RSS. And whenever there is an internecine conflict, some of the worst elements will, in a sense, slip out. Now, is the Prime Minister doing enough to send a signal that this is not going to be tolerated? I wish he would do more. But I think this political game is yet to be played out. On RSS control of appointments and stuff, there are two ways of reading it. I, at the moment, read it frankly that, you know, look, these have been their stormtroopers, both literally and metaphorically, right? I would read it as they're being thrown a bone rather than they're being allowed to take over the system. You know, and just one simple example, I mean, you know, and you have to be careful about how, you know, this whole idea that Mr. Dinanath Batra, this RSS ideologue, was supposedly going to rewrite history textbooks, right? All newspapers ran that story. All that he was allowed was that Gujarat government libraries would buy his book, not that his book was going to be made mandatory reading for the syllabus. I mean, it's a classic way in which you manage, right? So I'm actually not, I don't yet buy, obviously it's an issue of concern to all of us, but I don't see the momentum being there that you will actually get this massive saffron takeover of Indian institutions. I just think that, you know, they're just on the wrong side of history, and the underlying social momentum is in a very different direction.
That is a very brilliant exposition. I just have a question. Why should the states, and I'm not just thinking of states like West Bengal or Madhya Pradesh, of Uttar Pradesh and Tamil Nadu, Kerala, etc. I'm even thinking of states like Madhya Pradesh and Chhattisgarh. Why should they buy this idea? Because as you can see, 70–80% of central government work is policy work. 70–80% of the state government work is implementation. And I don't see any move where the state governments are getting terribly enthused about all this. So why should it happen?
Can you say, what do you mean by this? I mean, which particular aspect?
All the kind of changes and the cautious optimism that you talked about, regulatory changes. Why, for example, take the power sector. There is one CERC, there are 24 SERCs. Why should the states change their SERCs?
I'm Surya from ISAS. So you have referred to political inventiveness of Prime Minister Modi, particularly with reference to Jammu and Kashmir. I would like to know how far is that tactical and how much of strategic thinking is behind that, not just in terms of the upcoming elections in Jammu and Kashmir, but also he has been politically inventive, say, towards China in the context of India's relations with the US. Is that tactical also, or is there something strategic thought behind this? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for that wonderful exposition. Towards the end of the Manmohan Singh regime, one felt that it was the Supreme Court which was running the country, because almost all decisions by the central government was challenged and the Supreme Court made its own ruling. How would this fare in the Modi era? Thank you.
And I think there are two different angles from which this question can be asked, right? Which is, one is state chief ministers, including within the BJP, obviously worry about decentralization, right? I mean, this is a political centralization of an unprecedented scale, right? And what incentives do they have, in a sense, to kind of cooperate? And the second is kind of more administrative, which is you have state electricity boards, state electricity commissions that are bankrupt. Why should they reform? Why should they restructure? What's in it for them? I think two or three things, and that's where I think the underlying sociological dynamic is really important. So one of the things we know is India is not just urbanizing fast, it has already urbanized to a much greater extent than we think. In fact, almost all the official figures are actually understating the extent and form of Indian urbanization. You're actually in excess of 40%, right? Even if you look at rural incomes, right, now more than 60% is actually non-farm labor. One of the things that has done, interestingly, in large parts of India, I mean, obviously it varies, and there are some areas which, are not part of this, is that it has made the class and economic identities of voters much more complex than they were 15 or 20 years ago, right? And the short answer to why a chief minister will do it is the following, which is, if you don't deliver on power in 5 to 7 years, I mean, power is a big electoral issue in most states. I don't mean just electoral power, I mean the literal power, electricity, right? Right? Your prospects of getting re-elected diminish, right? You have a large young population that is looking to move out of agriculture, right, into something else, right? Ironically, even if you take something like land acquisition, which has been very politically contentious, we are in this interesting moment where there was a vicious circle where the poorer the state you were, the harder it was to do land acquisition, like in West Bengal and Odisha. Why? Because young people did not see any other alternative pathways, right? In a state like Haryana, clamor to actually have your land put on acquisition, partly because the economics of land has changed completely, right? So I think we should not lose sight of the fact that there is a underlying social change, right? In terms of the rise of the lower middle class, in terms of the fact that the agriculture, non-agriculture distinction is diminishing, the rural-urban distinction is diminishing, and the recognition that the conditions for participation in the economy, apart from education and welfare and food security, but that power and infrastructure are now absolutely central to this. That if you're a state government that you're not serious about it, right, you're going to actually bear the electoral consequences. Now, it's going to be difficult to do, and one of the things they're struggling with the power sector, right, is that they will have to come up with some kind of massive restructuring and rehabilitation package. You know, of the kind you did with debt in the late 90s and early 2000s, which finally got the state governments out of the vicious circle, right? I think there the center will have to do some hand-holding, right? But the underlying electoral incentives are in a very different direction. Last quick question on the Supreme Court. Very important question, and as I said, it is the joker in the pack. I mean, because the point about judicial power is it can be exercised whenever it wants to, in whichever form it needs to. I'll just say two things about it. One, and you know, this is a vulnerability still in this government. You know, the last government was not short of talented lawyers. In fact, you could argue it was probably done in by its talented lawyers, right? But I think the intellectual mistake they made, and forget the low politics of it, but I think the orientation was that, you know, you can go to a court and you can approach it in a semi-lawyerly way by saying, we have enacted this, here is an argument for why we've done it. And if you are inventive, you can always come up with an argument of some kind. But coming up with an argument is not the same thing as coming up with a credible argument that is actually backed by procedure and process. So, you know, what was the issue in 2G? Even the government could have said, look, this will keep calling rates low, this is a policy prerogative. But if you haven't even done the paperwork, literally speaking, why in an altered context should you justify this policy? If you look at the quality of court submissions by the previous government, I mean, you know, we underestimate the damage institutions like the Attorney General's office, like the Ministry of Law did. My own sense is, if you come up with a credible, and by credible I mean both sound on legal principle, but then backed up with a process that you can show to court, this is why we have arrived at this decision. The court will still defer to the executive, right? But governments, because they were used to that arbitrary exercise of discretion, had actually completely forgotten what that meant, right? I'll just give you one very simple example. I mean, just because there are a lot of power sector. A power project in India, when you file an environmental report, you have to show how much radiation that power project is going to emit, right? The government of India did not require of companies that you file a cumulative power radiation impact. So if an area has 6 power plants, obviously the amount of radiation will be times 6, right? But the approval was given on the fact that on the individual unit. Now this is common sense 101. Obviously a court will throw out such a radiation cube, right? That homework habit, neither the government and frankly even the bureaucracy, you'd be unsurprised at how used to it was the idea that it could actually get away with. I think that's where they'll have to invest most. If you look at every government department, the legal department is the weakest. The public prosecutor's department is non-existent. So if they invest in that, I think the court, judiciary, and the government can come to some accommodation.
Thank you, Professor Mehta. My name is Niaz Ahmed Khan. I'm from Bangladesh. Very insightful, and we had much food for thought even for Bangladesh. And I could see some parallelisms in the case of the recent Bangladesh politics. And I'll just try to focus on one point, the role of judiciary plus the use of, as you say, the arbitrary discretionary power, exercise of that power by the judiciary. Now, you are aware probably that the judiciary has in recent years got into loggerheads with the parliament and executive both. And in one instance, in the recent months, now the parliament has passed a new law saying that they could actually impeach the judges, the High Court and Supreme Court judges. And this provision was there in the 1972 version of the original Constitution of Bangladesh. Now they have revived this particular clause. Now, we remain concerned about this because we don't actually see what's coming up over the course of next few years, which will be crucial for this government. Any thoughts on this? Thank you.
Suhas Parshikar. Pratap, I would like to draw you back to this question of BJP's stand on Hindu communalism and nationalism. Some of us tend to believe that it is the periphery, the margins. You use the terms like some nasty elements, etc. My question is whether it is only some periphery or a larger sections of the society who are being persuaded by this. And therefore, I would ask you this question, whether the risk of majoritarianism is restricted only to some elements or it is actually becoming more prevalent among not only just the BJP supporters, but among the Indian society as a whole. And that is in a sense indicative of why Modi and the BJP can get elected on the rhetoric that they did. Thank you.
My name is Dr. Srinivas. I wear 2 hats. I'm an industrialist in infrastructure and logistics, but I'm also a BJP member. And I just want to give one comment and one question. Comment is, I think a lot of people get carried away by this media perception of what they talk about the majority and minority. Actually, what has happened is there's a great degree of minority appeasement for purpose of vote bank politics, which you're not focusing. And let me tell you, I can give 110 seats where, in fact, young aspirational Muslims voted for BJP. That's how the MPs got elected. Second, the misperception on RSS, what is being propagated. There are a section of fundamental elements in all religions. If you are from Hyderabad, you know, we have a minority fundamental elements. You have a majority of elements, fundamental elements in UP. But they are under check. If you see the last 90 or 120 days of Modi government rule, there isn't one single major outbreak of riots, which are other than some things which are localized because of other reasons. The second most important thing is what has happened is there is a governance, which wasn't there under the great London Economic School professors like Dr. Manmohan Singh, ably misguided by our so-called defunct Financial Planning Commission Deputy Chairman, and also an economist who never got elected himself, like Jairam Ramesh. So who actually created the policies which messed up the country? Who had no knowledge of the nerve and pulse of the people? So if you see the change today, it is a political acumen, administrative drive, backed up by a decisive mindset. That is what is changing. And my question to Professor Mehta, when you say architectural system is not in place, don't you think that we had too much of regulation and too much of architectural system which never allowed things to happen? And now these out-of-the-box solutions of Mr. Modi, making issues like Jan Dhan Yojana or Swachh Bharat, these are things which are actually becoming mass movement rather than a policy framework. Thank you.
I'll be very brief. I know we are running out of time. So I think one response, and kind of begin with the most uncontroversial and move up. I think one thing you have to give Mr. Modi credit for, whether you're a supporter or not, and it's quite an unprecedented phenomenon in Indian politics actually, is as policy analysts, as political scientists and economists, we are actually used to talking of market failures and state failures all the time. What's interesting about him is his constant reference to social failure. Now, he may not articulate it in forms which you and I in an ideal world actually agree with. But, for example, I think almost 35 to 38% of his speeches, if you did a content analysis of his election campaign, were actually on the issue of gender. Swachh Bharat, I mean, the idea that the Prime Minister of India would just tell you every day that you live in one of the filthiest countries in the world, right, is an absolutely unprecedented political phenomenon, right? And this idea that, which he says constantly, right, in a way that India needs a, through politics, an articulated discourse around social failure, is really quite interesting. Now, again, we can argue about, how much of it is photo op, whatever it is, but I think that is, in a sense, a new role for politics and political argument. I think the majoritarianism question that Suhas answered, very, very powerful and exactly the right one. Let me put it this way, okay? One question I think we need to ask ourselves, which is, how has the secularism debate been framed in India? And I don't want to frame it in the terms that the BJP member just did, minority appeasement. I mean that itself is a very problematic canard. But when I was traveling in Bihar last year, a young Muslim student asked me this question, and it's been haunting me since because it frames the question in a very interesting way. I was trying to argue, how wonderful Nitish Kumar was. And I was surprised at the depth of rejection of Nitish in Bihar. And he looked at me and said, okay, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. All this is fine, Congress, Nitish, secular. He says, I want an institutional articulation of secularism. I don't want an ideological articulation of secularism. What does he mean by that? He said, look, can you look me in the eye and say that if there is a Congress-governed state, the normal institutions of political life, police, finance institutions, all the kind of normal institutions we inhabit, are less likely to discriminate against Muslims than a non-Congress ruled state? Second, can you look me in the eye and say, if there is a riot, a perpetrator is more likely to be punished in a non-BJP ruled state than in a BJP ruled state, right? Not that the BJP did, but the Supreme Court came, right? And third, and this was the tough one, why after 60 years of Congress rule, do we still feel that the question has to be framed in these terms, right? Where we are constantly in this suffocating trap, this compulsory identity, right? Which the BJP member just fell into, right? Exemplified, right? And he said, look, I'm looking for now an institutional articulation. that goes beyond this. Don't throw Nehru and Gandhi at me. I don't want this debate, you know, is Savarkar communist or not. I want a yardstick whereby I want to see how institutions of the state behave. If tomorrow somebody creates the conditions for a riot, let's say Trilokpuri, what is going to be the state response, qua state, qua institution, right? I think on the ground, that's the real battle for secularism. Frankly, I think the way we articulate it is actually beside the point, which is one of the reasons why Congress lost. Actually, and Congress lost its trust. Are we becoming worse in that dimension? I'm not convinced, actually. Worse to what benchmark? I mean, we can talk about, you know, levels. Second, I do agree that, particularly on social media and certain forms of media, certain sections whose, let's put it this way, whose, I wouldn't call it, let's say, contempt for Muslims, right? Or their worry somehow that Muslims had been unduly appeased. I mean, it's a, you know, appeasement works all, right, as ways. I think that expression is a little bit more open, right? Are their numbers greater than before? I'm actually not convinced. I'm also actually not convinced also that in the cycles of Indian electoral politics, there is this inexorable logic towards greater majoritarianism. The very same voters who voted for NDA 5 years later turned around and brought the same lower middle class urban constituencies, voted 10 years of UPA back into power. Did that mean that they had fundamentally changed as voters? I'm not entirely convinced, right? So I think these things are a lot more kind of contingent and conjunctural in that, you know, in that sense. So I think what we'll have to watch is what are the institutional responses qua state that we are going to see, in a sense, kind of going ahead, and do those qualitatively, in a sense, change over time, right? And that, I think, battle is really on. I'm not as pessimistic, I think, as some are, or even perhaps I used to be 2 years ago. I think I have more faith in the kind of Indian electorate, I think, on this score. Just briefly, on your very important question about Bangladesh judiciary, I don't know the Bangladesh judicial system that well, though I followed some of the debate. I think in summary, let me put it this way. I think on balance, the yardstick for being able to remove a judge in impeachment should be extraordinarily high. If it's a choice between risking some judicial misdemeanor and risking greater political interference in the judiciary, I would go for risking judicial misdemeanor any day, right? I think there's a second question, which is the Indian debate, which is the quality of judicial appointments in the first place, right? And we've also just enacted a National Judicial Accountability Bill, which the UPA, right? I suspect the Supreme Court is going to tweak the bill to the point where I think, frankly, our current status quo was untenable, where nobody outside the judiciary had any say in the appointment of judges. But I think it's going to tweak it enough so that the non-judicial composition of that commission does not have veto power over any judicial appointment. But as I said, I mean, I despite my saying what I said about the judiciary and the capriciousness with which it sometimes can act, on balance, right, it's safer for a society to risk judicial independence, go with that, than allow for political interference.
I would like to thank Pratap for his very illuminating keynote address, and also for taking all your questions, and to you, the audience, for asking your questions. So I'd now like to invite you all to join me in thanking Pratap for this session.